everyone, in this class we'll learn about learning and memory. Learning and memory are closely related. Learning is impossible without memory, and memory has no meaning without learning. Learning. Learning refers to natural mechanism by which the individual changes his or her behavior on the basis of past experience. Learning is of two types, non-associative learning and associative learning. Non-associative learning. In non-associative learning, the subject learns about the properties of a single stimulus. It results when an animal or person is repeatedly exposed to a single type of stimulus. Two forms of non-associative learning are common in everyday life that are habituation and sensitization. Associative learning. In associative learning, subject learns about the relationship between two or between a stimulus and a behavior. Two forms of associative learning have been distinguished based on the experimental procedures used to establish the learning, that is, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning. Classical conditioning involves learning a relationship between two stimuli. It is also termed as a Pavlovian conditioning or conditioned reflex type 1. Characteristics of this conditioned reflex. A conditioned reflex is a reflex response to a stimulus that is acquired by repeatedly pairing the stimulus with another stimulus that normally does produce the response. It depends for its appearance on the formation of new functional connections in central nervous system. There is a reinforcement. It is a process of following conditioned stimulus with a basic unconditioned stimulus, which is must for retaining a conditioned reflex, otherwise it will extinct. Pavlov's experiments. This experiment demonstrates the classical conditioned reflex. When food, that is an unconditioned stimulus, is presented to a hungry dog, it produces salivation, which is a unconditioned response. If bell is rung, which is a conditioned stimulus, just before the food is presented, the dog learns to associate the bell with the food. Eventually, the ringing the bell, that is a conditioned stimulus, alone causes salivation. Note that if food fails to appear consistently when the bell is rung, the conditioned response fades away, a process called as extinction, or it is also called as internal inhibition. Therefore, a conditioned reflex needs to be reinforced frequently, otherwise it dies out. Physiologically, the occurrence of conditioned reflex is explained by formation of new functional connections in the nervous system. Operant conditioning. Conditioning is a form of conditioning in which animal is taught to perform some task, that is operate on the environment in order to obtain a reward or avoid punishment. The operant conditioning is of two types, that is reward conditioning or adverse conditioning. Reward conditioning, in that a naturally occurring response is strengthened by positive reinforcement, that is reward, and in adverse conditioning, here the naturally occurring response is weakened by negative reinforcement, which is punishment. Coming to memory. Memory is the ability to recall the past events at the conscious or unconscious level. It is the relatively permanent storage form of learned information. They can be either declarative or non-declarative. Declarative, explicit or recognition memory. It is associated with consciousness or at least awareness. It is dependent on the hippocampus and other parts of the medial temporal lobes of the brain for its retention. Explicit memory is divided into memory of events, that is also called as episodic memory, and also memory of words, rules and language, so that is called as semantic memory. Coming to non-declarative or implicit or reflexive memory. Memory does not involve awareness here. Its retention does not involve processing in the hippocampus in most instances, and it includes skills, habits, conditioned reflexes. Explicit memory and many forms of implicit memory involve short term memory and long term memory. Short term memory, in which it lasts for seconds to hours, during which the processing in the hippocampus and elsewhere lays down long term changes in the synaptic strength. Whereas long term memory, which stores the memories for years and sometimes for life. During short term memory traces are subject to disruption by trauma and various drugs, whereas long term memory traces are remarkably resistant to disruption. Mechanism of the memory, that is the cellular basis. Studies of memory retention and disruption of memory have revealed that both explicit and implicit memory are stored in stages by different mechanisms. Input to the brain is processed into short-term memory before it is transmitted through one or more stages, uh, that is intermediate or long-term memory, into more permanent long-term storage. Mechanism of implicit memory. Mechanism of short-term storage of implicit memory. The various mechanisms for simple forms of learning results from the changes in the effectiveness of synaptic transmission, and it includes habituation and sensitization. Whereas mechanism of long-term storage of implicit memory, it is the process by which the transient short-term memory is converted into stable long-term memory is called as consolidation. Consolidation of long-term implicit memory for simple forms of learning involves three processes. That is, it is it involves gene expression, it involves new protein formation, and it involves the growth of the synaptic connections. Much information is transferred between two hemispheres through the corpus callosum, although some is transmitted through the other commissure, for example, anterior commissure or hippocampal commissure. Coming to some of the applied aspects related to the memory and learning is Alzheimer's disease. It is characterized by progressive loss of memory and cognitive function in the middle-aged individuals. Thus, the condition is frequently associated with memory failure for recent events, lack of spontaneous activity and initiative with loss of intellectual functions, and there will be extrapyramidal and akinetic hypertonic symptoms and loss of spatial orientation. After 2 to 3 years, dementia, that is memory loss, becomes well established and focal symptoms occur such as aphasia, that is speech disorder, apraxia, that is inability to perform voluntary movements, and agnosia, that is inability to recognize objects in spite of intact sensory modality. Similar features in the old age, that is around 65 years, are called senile dementia. Both the conditions are caused by the degeneration of the cholinergic nerve terminals in the cerebral cortex and hippocampus. So this is in brief